Welcome back for part 2 of our traffic sign retroreflectivity webinar series. And we certainly appreciated all of the great questions from this morning's session. And we'll go ahead and turn things over to Ron. Hello, Ron.
Hello, Mike. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Hope everybody had a good break. Again, I want to echo what Mike said. I appreciate all the good questions. Keep them coming. We are probably a little bit behind schedule, so I will probably pick up the pace, but please, if there's a topic we need to discuss, you're interested in, just put something in the chat and Mike will interrupt me. So now we're getting into the assessment and then the management methods, and we're in the visual inspection methods. And the first one we're going to look at is the comparison panel procedure. And you can kind of see what's involved here. We'll go into more detail. Again, you'll see this slide multiple times. This is just to kind of orient you in terms of where we are in these different assessment and management methods. We're in the assessment method, nighttime visual inspection, comparison panel procedure. With this method, you can use any type of vehicle, any age inspector. So if you, like the fellow I mentioned in the Southeast, to the city hired college students during the summer, they can be inspector in this method. The initial inspection occurs at highway speeds with low beam headlamps. When they spot a marginal sign, pull over safely, install the comparison panel on the sign using some type of clip, like a binder clip. Step back kind of 25 feet or more away from the sign, and then hold the flashlight near the inspector's ear to kind of simulate the flashlight being near the eyes of the individual. And the comparison panels must have a retroreflectivity level at least that designated in the MUTCD. And this procedure has to be done at night. So don't be confused by the photos I'm showing you will all be daytime, but that's because we want you to see the procedure. But again, remember, this procedure has to be done at night. So you can see get my pointer again. You can see the panel is clipped on. Here's like a coupon clipped onto the sign. The inspector has stepped back. It should be 25 feet. That appears a lot closer. Holding the flashlight, little pen light next to his or her ears. If the panel is brighter than the sign, that means the sign fails because it's below minimum. If the sign is brighter than the panel, then the sign is good to go for another year. And we need to tie table 2A-5 to this method, and so that's why we use panels that are at or near the minimum retro levels. A big question is, where do you get comparison panels? And there used to be, one of the sign sheeting manufacturers had a little kit that had comparison panels. It had, I think, a light source, had some other things in it. Maybe some of you had that or still have that, but to my knowledge, that manufacturer stopped producing those comparison panels. So an issue is, how do you get these comparison panels? As the first bullet says there, if you have a retroreflectometer, and if your agency doesn't have one, you can rent them, maybe borrow one, maybe some LTAP centers have them. West Virginia does, where I am. Mike told me this morning that Ohio LTAP has a retroreflectometer that can be borrowed. So if you have access to a retroreflectometer and some, kind of a scrap pile of maybe out of service signs, or find in service signs near the minimum level, and then cut coupons from those sections that are at or near the minimum value and use those as your comparison panels. Some LTAP centers offer comparison panels created using transparency film on new sheeting, and I have to give David Orr at the at the New York LTAP credit for coming up with this. Some of you may remember that in the old days before PowerPoint, when people would give presentations, they'd put the presentation on clear transparency film and project it using an overhead projector. Well, those transparency films, they are clear, but they're not exactly clear. And so they diminish the amount of light by a little bit. And David in New York found that if you put maybe 1 or 2 or 3 sheets of transparency film on new sheeting, you could reduce the retroreflectivity. And so in West Virginia, we have adopted that same procedure, and this is the comparison panel kit that we make available to our LTAP communities in West Virginia. You can see here, it's a little coupon. This is black portion is just like a handle where you can grip onto it. But I think you can see that we cut the yellow microprismatic material out of a new sign sheeting that we purchased. And then I think you can see 1 or 2, I'm not sure how many layers of transparency film are on top of that. And of course, you're not going to get exactly the minimum values. This is the back of that, of a red sign, I should say. And notice so red is going to be much lower retro values, dark color. That's 7.3. So that's close to the minimum red value. And we also include the kind of, for legal purposes, the date that the coupon was made or manufactured by us or produced by us. And then we put it on a little plastic case. And here's what I was talking about this morning about work zone signs. Good practice to notice, put the signs vertically. They're separated by some distance. These panels are scientific, measuring instruments, if you will, to be maybe a little bit exaggerating about it, but you don't want to, throw these on the dash of a vehicle or on the windowsill in your workplace where they may get faded or scratched and those sorts of things. You want to keep these in good condition because they are scientific measurement devices. And again, here's the field procedure. These photos were taken, I think, on the plains of West Texas, so pretty level terrain. But for example, where I am in West Virginia, in southeastern Ohio, the terrain is not so level. We have to deal with ditches and steep slopes and that sort of thing. So one thing to consider with this method, of course, is personal safety. You see the PPE being worn, but also just sort of handling yourself or conducting yourself along the road, or you may have poison ivy, vines, other things like that. Personal safety becomes an important consideration. And here you see some more pictures. Notice a ladder is probably going to be needed. And again, remember, we shouldn't use signs to make the pass-fail determination, but here we're just doing it for educational purposes. Notice here that comparison panel is brighter than the sign, than the white on the sign. So I would say this sign would fail and should be replaced. This agency was really thinking. Notice they were able to cut out, I guess, of an old sign, the S and part of the T. So you have the white and the red on one coupon. That's kind of cool. I'm not sure you can always do that. But notice in this case, it looks like the sign is brighter, both for the white and the red, than the comparison panel. So that sign looks good to go for another year. And here you see some guide signs, some street name signs. Looks to me, you all may differ, but to me that the comparison panel looks about the same brightness for the white as the letter S here. So I mean, this could go either way. You could say, let's replace it now, or I probably wouldn't have an issue if somebody said, we're going to let this go another year and test it again next year. So you do get these areas where it may not be clear and you have to make a decision. Similarly here, can you see it? Sort of hard to see the panel because it is about the same brightness as the sign itself. Just a checklist, won't go through all of these. Select your vehicle and have the headlamps aimed. To me, that's more for liability exposure reasons, to reduce your liability exposure for risk management. I think if, at the start of your inspection season, if you have the headlamps aimed, and some of your larger agencies, you all have mechanics in-house that can do that. Other agencies may need to send it out to a commercial auto place to have that done, but it probably wouldn't hurt if in the file somewhere you have the invoice or the work order or something that shows that, on such and such a date, this vehicle's headlamps were aimed. If there would be a lawsuit, that can certainly help you overcome arguments being made by the plaintiff's counsel, and you can show that you're following the procedure appropriately. Prepare your inspection forms. The MUTCD doesn't require having a signed inventory. I think signed inventories are a great idea, and I urge local governments to have them, but they're not required. Make sure you have the appropriate equipment here in the middle, and I've sort of listed, not all of these things are required. If you prefer a paper pencil procedure, make sure you have that material. Maybe you're going to use a laptop or a tablet, that's fine as well. Make sure you have what you need. Notice I've included dash cam and recorder. These are optional, they're not required. I've had people tell me they prefer to just, rather than use a tablet or a paper and pencil, they prefer to just verbally or orally, speak into a recorder and then later get a transcript. And that's fine if you want to do it that way. I've had some agencies tell me they dash cam everything they do just so they can prove that they've been to every sign that was questionable. And again, that's fine, but that's not required. Make sure you have the comparison panels, and as I mentioned earlier, make sure you keep them in good condition, kind of in a protected environment. You're going to need a ladder. Make sure you have your PPE and other devices or warning signs that you might need. And make sure you wait until it's completely dark before you do this. How often do you need to stop and use these comparison panels? Not for every sign, only when the inspector observes a marginal sign. So only marginal signs. What size do the comparison panels need to be? MUTCD does not specify, but I would say it should be a convenient size coupon. I use the term coupon. To me, you wouldn't want to have such a big panel that it's difficult to attach it to the sign. Whatever convenient for you. What color do the panels need to be? Whatever color signs you have in your inventory. And what retroreflectivity level should the panels be? They should be at or near the minimum retro value for that particular color.
Hey, Ron.
So yes, sir.
Hi. We have a quick question from our audience, which is, if you have a full moon, does it skew the inspection results on the comparisons?
That's a great question. Great question. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a very good question. It might not be a bad idea to not do the inspection on the night of a full moon. Or maybe, maybe if clouds are forecast to move in, that probably would be okay. But yeah, that's a good point. A full moon could possibly skew your assessment. That's a good point. Thanks for that comment or question. The second inspection method is called the calibrated signs procedure. And this to me is more subjective than the comparison panel method. So we're still in the assessment method. We're still in the nighttime visual inspection procedures, but this method is called calibration signs. You can use any vehicle, any age inspector, but the way this works, before leaving say the maintenance yard, your facility, the inspector visually inspects a set of representative signs. Let me back up here. Like these. This is a setup for an agency's calibrated sign procedure. So what we're seeing is the inspector has stopped the vehicle at night and is spending a few minutes looking at those calibrated signs to kind of, quote, calibrate their eyes, if you will. before they start the inspection. And the FHWA recommends that the calibration signs be viewed at distances between 100 to 600 feet under low beam headlamps. Pretty much all of these assessment methods or inspection methods are under low beam headlamps, and the inspection occurs at roadway speeds. In other words, you don't need to travel at 10 or 15 miles an hour along the roadway. They should be done at kind of normal highway speeds, the speed limit or the prevailing speed of traffic on the roadway. And here you see another agency's setup. They mount them on, looks like the fence maybe around the maintenance yard. And again, these calibration signs must have a retro level at or above the minimum value designated by the MUTCD. Again, this method has to be done at night, and these calibration signs, because they are test specimens, they need to be maintained. So I hope these photos or these signs that you see here or these panels are just here for photo purposes, because these signs, as soon as the inspections are done, should be taken down and stored inside, out of the sun, out of the wind, and not exposed to potential things that might scratch them or damage them. And again, the way we tie it to table 2A-5 is that the calibration panels are at or above the minimum retro values. With this one, a serious issue is, where do you get the calibration signs? Again, I think the company that sold the little kit for retroreflectivity included not only comparison panels, but also calibration signs, which you'll notice are bigger than the comparison panels. But that company, as I indicated earlier, does not, I believe, produce that kit anymore. So, and I'm not aware of an LTAP that provides them, but they maybe some of them do. So what you're probably going to have to do is gain access to a retroreflectometer and look at some signs, in-service signs or out-of-service signs, and create or manufacture your calibration signs from maybe by cutting, panels out of existing signs. So that is, to me, one of the limitations of this method is the source of the calibration signs. But larger agencies, for example, a DOT, it's probably easier for them to maybe get these calibration signs than a smaller agency. Earlier in the week, I was teaching an LTAP safety class on a different topic. It wasn't on retroreflectivity, but we had some folks, engineers from the Alaska DOT in the class, and they mentioned that is the method that apparently the Alaska DOT uses. They use the calibration sign technique, or at least this particular district that was involved. So here's again the field procedure. Notice this is all within the kind of the maintenance yard, I guess, or the public works property, whatever you want to call it. This is, I guess, the drive out to the main road to leave the site. And so they've set up the calibration signs. You can see along the road, the inspector stops the vehicle, low beam headlamps, spends a few minutes here, kind of looking at those signs, calibrating their eyes, and then proceeding on. Notice this upper left one here. I guess the concern I have here is it looks like to me that it's not completely dark yet. So that's something to keep in mind. In fact, probably this time of year that we're in now would really be the ideal time to do this, at least in the northern hemisphere here. The days are short and the nights are relatively long, where in the summer, when maybe we'd prefer to do this, in some parts of the country, the nights may be relatively short, so you don't have as much time to do the inspections. So here's the field procedure. I think I've talked about these items. And then the signs that look less bright than the calibration signs are the ones that we would mark for replacement. Probably a good idea to include a route that allows the inspector to maybe come back to the maintenance yard to review the calibration signs again to kind of refresh their memory. And that you probably want to do that maybe for other reasons too, like maybe getting gas or refilling a coffee cup or using a restroom or that sort of thing. So it's probably a good idea if you can do it to come back to the kind of the base and then recalibrate the eyes of the inspector. In terms of review, what type of vehicle is needed for this method? It can be any type vehicle and can be any age inspector. How does this method compare to the comparison panel method? My personal opinion is that it's much more subjective because you're relying on kind of the memory or the mental calibration of the inspector's eyes. How many calibration signs do you need? One for every color of signs that you have in your inventory. Here's the checklist, which is probably very similar to the one we did for the comparison panels. Again, in terms of the equipment, you don't need everything that's listed there, but if you feel more comfortable using a dash cam or recorder, feel free to do that. The FHWA does not specify a particular items of equipment or particular method of the actual data collection.
Hey, Ron.
Yes.
Hi. As a follow-up to the previous question about a full moon scenario, the question from the audience is, could the same be said for other conditions such as fog, snow, rain, or light pollution?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, the light pollution one is kind of a tricky one to answer because I'm backing up. Like here, to me personally, that's a lot of kind of artificial light in the background there from businesses or homes or whatever, cell towers, whatever that all is. But that's that's sort of the environment we live in. This is where this particular maintenance yard is. So I guess you have to make do with the best you can. But those whoever asked that or commented on that, those are all good points. Personally, I would do these nighttime inspections under dry weather, so you don't have to worry about rain. But you raise a good point about at this time of year, or for the next couple months, maybe in many parts of the country, West Virginia, Ohio, upper Midwest, there may very well be snow on the ground, and you're right, that will affect the visibility of the sign. So ideally, it would be best to maybe avoid that. But again, I appreciate, for example, Alaska, they probably have to do their nighttime inspections at this time of year because in the summertime, it never really gets totally dark. But on the other hand, doing it this time of year in Alaska, invariably you're going to have snow on the ground. So I would try to, come up with, I don't know, a decent compromise of conditions, recognizing that it may not be ideal in certain aspects, and probably document all of that to help protect you from in case there's claims or lawsuits are filed. But I appreciate that comment. Those are very good comments. Any other questions come in, Mike?
We are good for now. Thanks, Ron.
You're welcome. The third nighttime inspection method is what's called the consistent parameter procedure. And you might say, what the heck does that mean? What consistent parameter? Consistent with what? Well, back in probably the late 90s, when Federal Highway Administration was conducting the research that led to these minimum retro values, they did a lot of on-the-road testing with actual drivers and actual vehicles. And the parameters that they used for this was they used a pickup truck or SUV vehicle, and they used an older driver. So that's what this slide shows, an older driver in an SUV type vehicle. And so that's what's meant by consistent parameter. The inspections are done in a SUV or pickup truck vehicle, and the inspector is an older driver. The operator doesn't have to be older, but the inspector needs to be an older driver. So that's what's meant by consistent parameter. And again, we're in the third and final visual nighttime inspection or assessment method. So in this method, you have to use an SUV or a pickup truck that has specific headlamp types, and we'll talk about those here in a few minutes. And the inspector needs to be at least 60 years old. Now, of course, this is an area, adds some subjectivity to this as well, because I think we all know people who are 60 years old who maybe have sort of the characteristics of a 40-year-old, but maybe we also know 60-year-olds who are more like maybe an 80-year-old. So that's the number that FHWA has specified, but of course not all 60-year-olds have the same physical or mental or visual characteristics as other 60-year-olds. So we have to bear that in mind when you're assessing the results. The inspection occurs at highway speeds with low beam headlamps, just like the other ones. One advantage of this method is that you don't need the calibration signs or comparison panels, but you do need a specific vehicle type and a driver of a specific age. And as I mentioned, this method simulates the conditions of the research that Federal Highway Administration used as the basis for coming up with the minimum retro levels. I mentioned headlamps. This is a key issue. It's something that's out of the control of traffic engineers and roadway engineers, and it's evolved considerably in the last few decades. I'm sure everyone kind of appreciates that. If you're out on the road at night, either as a pedestrian or a motorist, you see a variety of colors and intensities and arrangements of headlamps. And of course, each of the drivers of each of those vehicles will be seeing something different in terms of retroreflectivity, because each of the headlamp arrangements has different operating characteristics. And just quickly, before, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, most of the vehicles in the United States were manufactured with what was called sealed beam headlamps. And here you see kind of the pattern of a sealed beam headlamp. And notice we have it broken up into a quadrant here. And the red line is sort of the center line separating the upper half from the lower half. But one thing you notice, and this is true of headlamps in the United States, is they have a lower right bias, it's called. Notice the lower right quadrant is brighter or more intense than the other quadrants. And there's a couple reasons for this. One, of course, is that by having the brightest light here, it's not sort of aimed up at oncoming drivers, and so you can make your headlamps brighter without necessarily blinding oncoming drivers. But also, many roads have edge lines, white edge lines on them, or fog lines, as some people call them. And a lot of motorists use those edge lines to navigate. And so notice by having the most intense light in that quadrant helps illuminate those edge lines. But notice, even though the most intense light is down here below the center line there, the horizontal center line, notice there is some light up above that red center line. But then about, I don't know, 20, 25 years ago, the auto industry, without really any communication or contact with the roadway folks or public works people, developed and began using what's called the cutoff pattern. And here's what you'd see if you shined your headlamps, say, against the wall or your garage door or something like that. And again, we have the quadrants. Notice the lower right quadrant is still has the most intense light. But one thing I think you can see pretty clearly is notice above that center line, there's really no light. There's a little light here, I guess, but really no light. Notice it's much blacker than for the sealed beam headlamp. And I guess that's why it's called a cutoff pattern. It literally cuts the light off here at the midpoint or mid-level. But if you think about it, where are our signs located? Well, of course, our signs are here above the roadway. And so while this improved maybe automotive driver visibility of the roadway and things like that, it actually made it more difficult for drivers to see signs at night because the signs were less bright. So it's sort of been a combination of things. This movement to the modern cutoff headlamp pattern, and you saw the growth in older drivers on the roadway. And so these things together were what was kind of the impetus for Federal Highway Administration to develop the minimum retro values. So a question comes up. I mentioned you have to use a specific type of headlamp, and it has to be what's called, what the automotive industry calls visually optically aimed, VOA, visually optically aimed. So the headlamps need to be visually optically aimed headlamps. And the way you determine that is, notice you look at the headlamp assembly, and this vehicle says VOR, so that would be the right assembly, visually optically aimed headlamp, or this is VOL, that's the left headlamp, again, visually optically aimed. So we need to make sure the pickup truck or the SUV that would be used in this procedure has the VOA headlamps, and this is how you determine that. Personally, I would recommend a two-person crew. Have a younger person be the driver, and then have the older, the person 60 plus years old, have them be the inspector. Again, it has to be an SUV or pickup truck with the VOA style headlamps, and the driver, I'm sorry, the driver can be any age, but the inspector has to be at least 60. It's done at highway speeds, and the inspector just concentrates on judging sign retro, like rated as adequate, marginal, or poor. Poor meaning that the sign is recommended for replacement. So again, there's some subjectivity in this as well. Our checklist is kind of similar to what we saw before. Again, I think it's important to make sure you have a record that those headlights were aimed, you know, at a regular basis. Make sure you have your inspection forms or your devices ready to go. And again, be sure to wait for complete darkness until you begin the process. And the inspector would probably need to be trained to evaluate both colors of signs with two retroreflective colors. For example, white on red for a stop sign or yield sign. They'd need to be advised and trained that they need to look at the brightness of both of those colors. So what are the advantages of this method? Well, for one thing, you don't have to worry about having comparison panels or calibration signs. To me, those are maybe the main advantages. Limitations of this method, you'd have to have a driver of a specific age or above a specific age. And of course, there's the subjectivities involved there. As I mentioned, not every, say, 60 or 70-year-old has kind of the same visual characteristics. So that is a limitation in my mind. And this last question is really a rhetorical question because the answer will probably differ for each of your agencies. But of all the visual inspection methods we've talked about, which would be the preferred method for your agency? Or maybe none of these, but the answer is probably going to vary depending on the agency's size and resources and other characteristics.
Thanks,
So
Ron. Hey,
yeah,
quick question.
sure.
Yep, we have a question from Danielle, which is, do we test low-speed roads at highway speeds?
Well, when I say highway speeds, I kind of mean either the speed limit or the prevailing speed of traffic. So yeah, for lower speed roads, I would assess them at whatever kind of the prevailing speed of traffic would be on that roadway, which, you know, may be 25, 30, 35 miles per hour as opposed to 55 or higher speed roads. Yeah, I would do it based on probably the prevailing speed of traffic or the posted speed limit.
All right, thanks, Ron.
So we've looked at the visual nighttime inspection methods. There's 3 of them, and these fall under the assessment methods as identified by the MUTCD. Just to kind of review some common visual inspection features, I keep mentioning I'd aim the inspection vehicle headlamps maybe at the start of each season, mainly as a risk management technique to show that you're attempting to do your due diligence and follow these procedures in a rational, objective manner. For any of these, probably from a safety standpoint, maybe 2-person crew would work best. Having an inventory is preferred. Sign inventory, but it's not required. Use low beam headlamps. Try to minimize the interior vehicle lighting so you don't have, say, glare or reflections coming off the windows. Have your evaluation form and criteria established. And again, as I said, do the evaluations at roadway speed. I think I mentioned this, a good idea to have a sign inventory, but not required. It does give you documentation that the inspections were conducted, just in case there is a claim or a lawsuit. May also help you identify missing signs. And here's an example just to show that this doesn't have to be a complicated sort of thing. I mean, you can add more fields here if you'd like to, but not necessary. Notice this particular agency, their sign retro inspection form is just the sign description, the color, the location, and then they rate them good, marginal, or replace. So it doesn't have to be an involved, complex sort of system. It can be if you prefer that, or it can be relatively simple. Any questions on that? Those were the visual nighttime inspection methods. Again, remember, they need to be done at night.
Thanks, Ron. We do not see any questions at this time.
Okay, thank you, Mike. That brings us to the second assessment method. And remember, the assessment methods, we look at or touch every sign. That's what makes them the assessment method. We look at or touch every sign. And when I say touch, here's what I'm talking about. Notice we're using an instrument, the retroreflectometer, which is a contact instrument. It needs to be in contact with the sign sheeting to get a reading of the R value, if you will, the retroreflectivity value. And so again, we're in the assessment methods, and this is called measured sign retro. And it includes the sign retroreflectivity measurements of in-service signs. And the measurements are made with devices that some people say are similar to cordless drills. They're kind of handheld devices, or sometimes I call them the guns, because they are somewhat analogous to a gun in terms of gripping the base of it. And the measurement devices must be in contact with the sign face. That's why I keep saying sort of touching the sign or contacting the sign. And these measurements need to be periodically repeated. So annually or every other year, just as with the inspections, because of course the signs weather and degrade and deteriorate over time. So we need to monitor that change in retroreflectivity. And this sort of shows what I was just talking about. Notice some types of sheeting, these are all the beaded types of sheeting, but notice how they deteriorate relatively quickly and would fall below the minimum values. I think I mentioned earlier this morning that, remember, we under the MUTCD now, we should not be using engineering grade sheeting for warning signs or work zone signs. That's because this is engineering grade type 1. It may be barely at the minimum R value brand new, and you can see it's going to deteriorate below that after maybe a relatively short time out on the roadway. There are two commonly used devices in the United States, and I'm not trying to promote or endorse any of these devices, but I'm just want to share the information with you. One shown on the left there is the Road Vista device, and the one on the right here is the model GRX by Retrosign. These are some of the key features of each. The Road Vista is what's called an annular device. The Retrosign is a point device. And so they operate in a different fashion, if you will. And so you can't one year use, say, the Road Vista and the next year use the Retrosign and compare the results, because the results are not really comparable. So once you pick a model or brand to use, you should stick with that. They have they're GPS equipped. They have data storage and download capability. Both have removable, rechargeable batteries. Remember this morning we talked about the geometry. Both have entrance angle of 4 degrees and a variety of observation angles. Barcode readers. They have extension pole kits available. I think that was illustrated. Yeah, here you see this is the extension pole that can be used, that comes with the device for signs that are well above what the inspector can reach. The measurements are provided at standard geometry. Both of these devices comply with ASTM E1709, which is the standard test procedure, standard test method for measurement of retroreflective signs using a portable retroreflectometer. So again, that if you're using this method to check your signs, this would be something to note. Again, if there'd ever be a lawsuit or a claim or something, you can demonstrate that the device you're using complies with the recognized ASTM standards. They have the ability to store data. They're relatively easy to use. And as I said, they have rechargeable batteries. But as one of the questions mentioned this morning, another thing to consider with these retroreflectometers is every few years they need to be calibrated. They are precision optical devices, and so handling and usage and so forth can affect the operation of them. So they do need to be recalibrated periodically. And here, just quickly, the distinction between the two. The Road Vista is an annular device, so you can sort of see here how it operates. The Retrosign GRX is a point instrument. Are there differences between the two? I mentioned, yes, there are differences. For sheeting materials made with glass beads, there's probably no practical differences. But for prismatic sheeting, you can see here measurements from different devices can be as much as 25% different. So you can't really compare the results from one device to another. And another thing to keep in mind, always make the measurements with the devices held at the same orientation. So that would be important to train or instruct the crews in the field that are actually making the measurements. The device needs to be held at the same orientation each time. And in West Virginia, we have the GRX device in our loan program. Mike, I don't know if you happen to know off the top of your head what Ohio LTAP has, but
Yeah, we have the Road Vista device.
Okay, so Ohio has the Road Vista device, which is just as good. And those of you not from Ohio or West Virginia, you might check with the LTAP center in your state. Many, but not all LTAPs do have sign retroreflectometer loan programs. And so if you'd like to use one, whether it's to measure your signs or to create comparison panels, whatever it might be, check with your state's LTAP center. And here's some other views of ours. You see the front face view that would be in contact with the sign, and then you see the the screen in the back of the device. The field procedure would be to make a note of the type of sheeting, and this is where that sign sheeting identification sheet that I mentioned earlier and showed you earlier would come into play. The crews should have a copy of that. And you need to measure each color that is retroreflective. So on a stop sign, red and white. On a street name sign, green and white, and so forth. Need to make multiple measurements and compute an average. I don't know if you remember earlier, I showed you some measurements I had made on certain colors and types of sheetings, and I think I always stated it as R sub average or R sub AVG. That's because it was an average of 4 measurements. And develop a measurement protocol for your agency. And I mentioned that you may need an extension pole or a ladder. And there's that sheeting identification guide I talked about. It'd be good to provide this, both sides of this, to your crews that are actually using the retroreflectometer. Here's an example of measurement protocol. Those are not bullet holes in the sign. This is this agency's protocol for stop signs. So each black circle here, so in the red on the stop sign, this is where they would make 4 measurements, and then they take the average and report the average. And the retroreflectometer device will do that for you. And then for the white on the word stop, notice they take readings for different the 4 different letters here, and the location is shown. And again, you take the average of the retro value and report that. And that 4 is, I mean, that's my suggestion. There's FHWA or the manual doesn't specify anything, but personally I would say at least 4. If you want to use more, that would be fine, but probably a minimum of 4 measurements per color. In terms of the measurements, like the comparison panel method, you're going to be in the right of way, so safety should be the highest priority in terms of PPE, traffic control if necessary. And if signs, as I said, are usually out of reach, so you may need a ladder or extension pole. For overhead signs, you're probably going to need a bucket truck. And I mentioned that the memory in the device can save the readings. Here you see taking measurements. The outer 2 show the use of the extension pole. The center image, it looks like he's using a ladder. Notice this is what I mean by orientation. I'd call this sort of vertical here. Notice the device is kind of vertical with respect to the sign. This one, it's hard to tell because we're looking at it from the side, but it almost looks like the inspector there is holding it kind of at 90 degrees to vertical, which is fine as long as every measurement is made at that orientation. Remember I said the orientation of the device needs to be uniform. So it really doesn't matter what you decide to use, but you need to make sure that every measurement is made at that same orientation. What about advantages or disadvantages of this method? It really does provide the most direct means of monitoring the maintained retroreflectivity values. You can look at the readings you've gotten, the average readings, and you can compare that directly to table 2A-5 and see whether or not it is above or below the minimum. So from that standpoint, it does remove a lot of the subjectivity. Disadvantages, one is the cost of the instrument. You can see they're probably $10,000 to $12,000 each. And of course, every few years, you're going to have it recalibrated, which, as I think I mentioned, for West Virginia LTAP, I think it was about $2,500 or $3,000 when we had ours recalibrated. So there's also a significant periodic cost. Another disadvantage is, measuring all signs in a jurisdiction can be time consuming. Remember, you have to take 4 measurements on each color on each sign. And there still is some subjectivity because even if you have a measurement protocol, there's certain parts of the sign may be different from others. And so notice I said in the first bullet, it removes a lot of the subjectivity, but not all of it. People shouldn't have kind of the false impression that using this gun doesn't have any subjectivity associated with it, because there is some associated with it. And then the other thing, getting back to what I mentioned kind of at the start this morning, is using retroreflectivity as the only indicator of whether or not a sign should be replaced may end up neglecting other attributes of the sign. For example, has it been bent or twisted, or is there vegetation in front of it? Those kinds of things. So we still need to, maybe the crews need to be trained and made aware of these other factors that can affect sign retroreflectivity. In terms of knowledge check, how many measurements are needed on each sign? It's not specified by FHWA or by the manual, but as I said, I would recommend a minimum of 4 measurements on each color, each retroreflective color on a sign. How often should signs be measured? I would say annually or every other year they should be measured. Here's an interesting question. Should you clean the sign before taking a measurement? And there's no clear answer for that. There's no specification or requirement or manual or even a suggestion, I guess, in the MUTCD. My thought on this, I know some agencies clean their signs on a regular basis, once or twice a year. Other agencies maybe don't clean their signs, and that's fine. But I would say if your agency's practice is to clean the signs, like annually, I would say then clean the sign before you take a measurement. If your agency does not clean your signs, that's fine too, but then I probably wouldn't clean the sign before I took a measurement. So make the measurements kind of consistent with how you handle cleaning signs, or whether you handle cleaning signs. And here's a rhetorical question. Again, the answers will differ depending on your agency, but would you rather measure signs during the daytime or do nighttime inspections, as we talked about earlier? And the results will certainly depend on the agency. Again, their resources, their staffing, other things, other factors that come into play.
Hey, Ron.
Yeah,
We have 2 questions, if that's okay.
sure.
First question was from Amir, who says, does a retroreflectometer need to also be used at night?
No. I mean, I guess you could use it at night, but no, it doesn't have to be used at night. It can be used, and I think most folks use it during the day. My concern at night would mainly be sort of safety related. As I mentioned earlier with the comparison panels, there may be not only traffic related issues, but just sort of roadside condition related issues, because you have employees maybe outside the ditch line on steep slopes, or in vines and poison ivy and that sort of thing. So there's those kind of safety related issues like trips and falls and what's the word I'm looking for? Poisonous type of plants and things. But that's why I probably would prefer to do, if I was in charge, I would probably do it during the day, but there's nothing, to prohibit using the devices at night.
Thanks, Ron. Next question is from John. He says, if using a retroreflectometer, are overhead signs able to be assessed with a different method, safer method covered earlier, such as calibration, and still be considered acceptable to the MUTCD standard?
I'm thinking, I would say yes, as long as you're using one of these accepted or identified methods. I would say yes. Wouldn't see why you couldn't use one of these other methods, For some smaller agencies, they may not have a bucket truck, or even if you have a bucket truck, of course, there's also kind of issues with temporary traffic control and those kind of things. So I could see that maybe an agency would want to use a different method to check overhead signs, and I think that would be fine. I'd probably want to document, why you were doing that, and also document to show that the method you're using is one of these identified assessment methods. But personally, I wouldn't have an issue with that. That's a good question, though.
All right, thanks, Ron. Those are all the questions for now. Thanks.
Great, thanks for the good questions. So here, just again, it's problematic using photographs to kind of illustrate retroreflectivity, but these are just some various signs that I have in my sort of inventory for when I teach in-person classes. I'll bring them into the room and we look at them and turn the lights out and use a flashlight to see how bright or not so bright they are. But I also ran the retro gun on these, and these are average values. I should have put R sub average there, but I didn't. But this is a engineering grade. It's actually a toy sign. It's not a full-size yield sign. It's more for training purposes. And it's engineering grade, of course, so it's beaded sheeting. It's I keep it inside wrapped in paper, so it's never weathered or anything. I try to keep it from avoid scratching with other surfaces. And here you can see the white was 99. The white retro was 99. The red was 25.5. The contrast ratio 3.88. So it looks like everything is good. All of those are above the minimum values. These are not signs, of course. This is just some of the sheeting, but this is blue engineering grade. So it's beaded sheeting, blue. Notice the R average is 2. That's not going to be very bright at night, almost 0. But that's because it's beaded sheeting, and also because of the dark blue color. That's what accounts for that very low retro value. And then this is some red diamond grade prismatic. So this is a high quality material. This is brand new. The red average is 54.5, which should be well above the minimums that are in table 2A-5. This is a fluorescent orange prismatic sign, temporary traffic control. It's also new. It's a little bit dinged up on the edges, but the sheeting itself is not really scratched or damaged. And notice one thing again that you kind of see clearly here is notice there's mirror retroreflectivity, because this sign has never really been outside. I tried to take good care of it, and so you can see the sky and trees, reflections from trees in this sign. So you're seeing mirror retroreflectivity. But when I took the gun to it, the retro gun, this had a R average of 376. So that's well above the minimum values. And assuming that sign is, properly cared for and so forth, that should be a considerable amount of time before that drops to say 75 or 50 in terms of the retroreflectivity value. Then how about this one? And this is some portable sign material, and there's a variety of different materials that are used. So we're just talking about this one. There are other, of course, portable sign materials used. But I took the gun to this and got an average of 39. So my question is, what does this mean? Can we use this material, or can we not use it? Or can we use it only under certain conditions? Any thoughts? If anybody has any thoughts, feel free to type it in the chat, and Matt and Mike will interrupt me. But what does this mean that this is 39? Does it mean we shouldn't use this material or similar materials, or can we use it only under certain conditions? Or anybody have any thoughts on that? And again, remember that this is for this particular type of material. I'm not suggesting that all portable sign material has an R of 39, but this particular sample that I had did have an R of 39.
Hey, Ron, Michael says daytime only.
There you go. Really, that covers it, Michael. Thank you. Yeah. This is less than the minimum, right? Minimum being what, 50? So 39, of course, less than 50. But the retro, as Michael said, the retro values apply to nighttime. So we can use this during the day when the retroreflectivity properties don't really apply. But we shouldn't leave these types of signs up overnight where they're going to be on the road during darkness. So yeah, thank you, Michael. Great response there. Any other questions on that? So those of you that use temporary signs like this, you might want to check the retroreflectivity of the material, because I know some agencies I've seen recently have left them up, and as an older driver, to be honest, I couldn't read the message on the sign because the sign was between my older eyes and the low retro value. The sign was not bright enough to communicate with me. So something to check, especially from a legal liability standpoint. Make sure the materials that you're using at night on your temporary traffic control devices comply with the MUTCD. Any questions or concerns or comments on any of that material? So we've talked about sign retro this morning, and continuing here, we've also talked about the assessment methods. There's 3 nighttime inspection methods, and then the other assessment method is the use of the retroreflectometer.
Hey, Ron, thanks. We have the questions box open, so for our audience, please feel free to type in any additional questions at this time. Ron, there was a question from Long Beach, California, asking about different brands and manufacturers of retroreflectometer. I mean, we've mentioned, I think, 2 types of retroreflectometers today. We generally don't try to promote any particular types, but I just generally just let people know they can search online for different types of devices.
That's correct. Yeah, thank you, Mike. Yeah, I think, again, I'm not promoting or endorsing any product, but I think it's probably fair to say that at least in the public works community, the 2 that I've showed you, the GRX and the Road Vista, those are probably the most commonly used devices by state and local governments. But as Mike suggested, you can do a Google search to find other vendors or other folks that provide similar sort of devices. Thanks, Mike.
Yep. And Ron, do we have some additional sections of slides to proceed with?
Yes, I want to talk now about the management methods.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, before we get into the management methods, I do have talk about some additional considerations. And one of those is, will these methods we reviewed be effective in all conditions? And of course, the answer is no. And in fact, someone commented on, what about if there's snow on the ground, or what about if it's raining, or what about if it's a full moon? Those are all good things to consider when you're planning your inspection or assessment program. Can you think of some other field methods that might be used to evaluate traffic sign retroreflectivity? Maybe some of you have them. I remember reading, and actually I heard a presentation at a conference a few years ago. There was a jurisdiction in North Dakota, and in fact, I think maybe North Dakota LTAP was involved, where they would mount on top of a pickup truck some high intensity lights or lamps, and they were actually doing their inspections during the daytime. And apparently they had done an engineering study to show that gave them equivalent results to the methods that are identified in the MUTCD. So that's one that people had been, or at least were experimenting with, but to be candid, I'm not sure I've heard much about that since then. So I don't know if it proved not to work out or what the story was, but people are seems constantly trying to come up with additional methods, and that's good. We should be encouraging innovation, but just make sure you can demonstrate that the results from the method that you might be proposing is consistent with the methods you get from these other assessment techniques that we've talked about. Or how about this? Notice we see a school zone sign here, but it's plastered with snow. So at this particular time, the instant this photo was taken, would you agree this sign did not comply with table 2A-5? And in fact, I would think the public would probably prefer that our public works crews be spreading salt and plowing snow rather than cleaning snow off the sign. So this is a good example of a sign that doesn't meet the minimum retro values, but as long as the agency has selected and is using an assessment or management method, they're considered to be in compliance with the MUTCD. Another issue to think about, and someone mentioned this in their comment or question about maybe lighting or background lighting in an area. A good question is rural versus urban areas. And I should note, I probably haven't mentioned it before, but the minimum retro values in table 2A-5 are based on, of course, older driver vision. We talked about that. They're based on the specific type of headlamp. They're also based on sign recognition and legibility. And they're also, that research was done in rural areas without much background lighting. And of course, rural areas, some areas there can really be no sort of background or artificial lighting in the area in some of our rural areas. So that's something to keep in mind. And a question then is, what happens in urban areas? So here, I know all of us are probably on different devices. And if I was in the classroom with all of you, I would pull the shades and turn off the lights to look at this next image. I realize all of us may have some sort of background lighting of our own that may influence how we see this, but this is you can see this is a driver's eye view of an urban arterial roadway. And there is a sign here. Maybe you can see it. It's toward the center of the image. And this sign is at the minimum retro value. Can you see it there? There it is, a sign at the end of a median island, a black and white sign. And as I said, the white in that sign is at 50. It's the minimum retro value. But would you agree with me that in this environment with the traffic signals, the headlamps of oncoming vehicles, maybe there's some street lights, maybe some lighting from strip malls or something like that, I would argue it's kind of difficult to see that sign. So in urban environments, we may want to think about using retro values higher than the minimum, because remember, the values in the MUTCD are based on data from or research in rural areas. So just something to think about. So here we are again. You've seen this slide many times. We've talked about the assessment methods, which are on the left here. And the assessment methods, the key thing about them is you look at or touch or come into contact with every sign in your system. On the right side are the management methods, where you do not have to look at every sign. So let's look at some of these management methods. And the first one we'll look at is expected sign life. And again, just a reminder, all of these are described in, I won't say great detail, but in a fair amount of detail in this Know Your Retro publication from Federal Highway Administration. And this is one of the PDFs that Mike has posted for you. You can download these documents. And I would urge you download this one, because this sort of supplements the MUTCD. In fact, it's mentioned in the MUTCD as one of the documents. So expected sign life, what you do is find the life of the sheeting type in your area, and then replace the sign when that expected life is reached. And here's a couple agencies' techniques for doing that. Notice this particular agency puts the installation date, if you will, of the sign right on the front of the sign. So and say their expected sign life is, for this type of sheeting, maybe is 15 years. So at what, 2010, the agency would know just from a drive-by kind of inspection that they need to replace this stop sign. And the way these management methods work, you would replace this stop sign based on its expected life. It might still be in good condition, relatively good condition, but based on the expected life, you would replace the sign at that point. And other agencies may put, a sticker or something on the back or the front of the sign. Looks like with these methods, these agencies, the inspector would need to pull over and stop and actually read these or look at the back of the sign to determine whether or not it needed to be replaced. A big question with this method is, how do you determine sign life? And here you see, I guess this is a state DOT's sign rack where they have a variety of different signs and sheeting types arrayed there, and they have a retroreflectometer. So every year or even multiple months, they could check the retro value of these signs to determine when the sign has reached the end of its useful life, when it's the R value drops below the minimum. So larger agencies, as I say, can build and use a rack like you see there. Probably smaller agencies not able to do that. You can measure existing signs with known installation dates and compare to the minimum level. You can use weathering data or nearby jurisdictions' weathering data, or I'm sure many DOTs would be willing to share their weathering data with local governments or with LTAPs. And in a particular state or region of the state, it would be appropriate to share that data, to use that data. AASHTO, American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, they have data from evaluating a variety of products. And here you see, looks like an inspector with one of the older types. That was the Delta retro gun, is checking the retroreflectivity, it looks like, of a blue and white test panel on a sign rack. Or maybe the simplest way, which I know a number of agencies use, and some states as well, is to use the warranty information from the sheeting company. If they say this sign sheeting is warranted for 15 years, document that and say we're going to use a sign life of 15 years. So that's probably kind of a simple, quick and simple method of estimating your sign life. Advantages of this method, the expected sign life. It does require that agencies track the installation date. You can use, as we saw, a date sticker or barcode or computerized sign management system. And agencies can develop or copy local service life levels. Or, as I said, you can even use the life that the sign manufacturers warranty the product. Disadvantages, it may be time consuming to inspect the date stickers, especially if the date stickers are not easily viewable from the roadway. Another possible difficulty relates to marking signs that needs to be replaced. So that was a kind of an overview of expected sign life. Another management method is blanket replacement. Blanket replacement. And what this means is that all signs in an area or a corridor are replaced at the same time at specified intervals. And the specified intervals could be set based on expected sign life. For example, some existing blanket sign replacement policies, that exist use 10 to 12 years for beaded high intensity sheeting signs. And the way it would work is you divide your jurisdiction into areas or corridors or zones like you see on the sketch on the right. This might be a municipality. You know, and maybe, I mean, a municipality could do it by, say, wards or whatever you call the subdivisions within your municipality. This bluish or grayish area here, this might be the first ward of your city. And under this method, you would replace all the signs in this area during the first year. And then the second ward, you'd replace all the signs in the second ward during the second year, and so forth. And then maybe you have 10 or 12 wards, just making that up. And your sign life is, say, 12 years. Then after year 12, you go back to Ward 1 and you replace all those signs in Ward 1 in year 12 or year 13. So that's how it works. You replace all the signs in a particular zone or area or corridor. Main advantage or benefit of this method is that all signs are replaced. So there's kind of low likelihood of a given sign being skipped over or not replaced. So it ensures that all replaced signs are visible and meet the minimum retro levels. Main disadvantage or drawback of this method is there is some potential for waste. Now, let's say a stop sign had been knocked down a couple years ago and a new sign was installed. Under this method, that 2-year-old, let's say, or 1-year-old stop sign would have to be replaced, even though it's only 2 years old. So there is that potential for waste. Remember, in this method, we don't look at individual signs. We just replace based on age, or in this case, we just replace every sign in a particular area. And so there is some potential for waste. Another disadvantage, it's not on the slide, but that I have heard about this method is that blanket replacement may not allow or provide for looking at other sorts of things like vegetation in front of signs and that sort of thing that you would see if, say, you were doing an assessment method where you were inspecting the signs. So that's blanket replacement. The third management method is the use of control signs. And this is what you do here is estimate sign life using a subset of signs. And these could be on-road signs, or they could be signs in your maintenance yard or in a sign rack or something. But what you do is kind of get a sample of different signing conditions, like a south-facing stop sign, or a west-facing warning sign, or a north-facing street name sign. And then you monitor those control signs of each of those conditions. And when that control sign drops below the minimum retro level, you replace all signs in that category. For example, you might replace all south-facing stop signs or all north-facing street name signs. And as I mentioned, these control signs can be actually in-service signs on your roadway, or they can be signs in a maintenance yard. Or we have one agency here in West Virginia that they have a nice city building. They put a rack on the roof of the city building with a sign array, and every year they measure the retro values of those signs that are literally on their roof of the building. So that's another potential method to think about. It's not very labor intensive. It does require use of a retroreflectometer. It is relatively low cost. But on the downside, you do need to have an adequate sampling of signs. And as I said, these signs can be in service or signs that are placed in a designated area like a maintenance yard or a rooftop or that sort of thing. So those were the 3 identified management methods that are talked about in this FHWA publication that you see there on the right. They also make allowance for future methods. So they give agencies some flexibility. Agencies can develop their own methods, but the key thing is, like some other things in the MUTCD, these must be based on an engineering study. So you can come up with methods, but make sure that you do an engineering study to show that the results are comparable to what you'd get from one of the other techniques that we've talked about. So again, documentation is important. And then they also provide for combination of methods. And a number of agencies use this. Some agencies may use nighttime visual inspection, but then measure selected signs with a retro gun to kind of confirm that they're getting good results from their nighttime visual inspection methods. Kind of, as it says there, use one as a quality control of another. And maybe some of you are using kind of a combination of methods like this. I think this has a lot of benefits. So these are the methods allowed in the MUTCD, or in that associated document that's mentioned in the MUTCD. The assessment methods, which are the visual nighttime inspection methods, the three of them, the measured sign retro, and then the management methods, which are the expected sign life, blanket replacement, control signs, and also agencies can develop future methods or can combine methods. But what I would say, regardless of, especially under the future or the combination, make sure you document what you're doing and why you're doing it in case there would be tort claims filed against the agency. You're able to show you did your due diligence and that your methods comply with the spirit of what the MUTCD calls for. So what should your agency do now? Act casual, say nothing, and hope nobody notices, or be proactive and help drivers in the nighttime driving environment. So if you've not already done so, I would say the first thing your agency should do would be to select the maintenance method, the assessment and or the management method, and then budget to implement that method. Train the inspectors, and remember this class would be considered training for the inspectors. Right now, there is no certification, if you will, for inspecting traffic sign retro, but a course like this would qualify someone to be called a trained inspector. Then implement the maintenance methods. Decide on the sheeting types, considering the initial and the life cycle costs, and then budget for future sign replacement. And relative to that, here we see kind of schematically the retro levels for new yellow sheeting materials. So on the horizontal axis, we have the ASTM sheeting type, and on the vertical axis, we have the retro values. Remember, candelas per lux per meter squared, 0 to 50, all the way up to 400. So notice engineering grade yellow sheeting, even brand new, is right about 50. There's an asterisk here. That's why there was an asterisk in table 2A-5, because notice even brand new yellow sheeting is just at 50. In fact, it doesn't even meet the 75 requirement for certain conditions. Super engineering grade, closer to 100. R value brand new. High intensity, what's that, maybe 170. But the prismatic average yellow, notice, is between 350 and 400. So this should last a considerable length of time before these values drop to the 75 or 50 value. And here's showing a chart showing the generalized life of yellow sheeting. These are the R values vertically here, and this is the years or time, and this would be the minimum value, again, of yellow sheeting. 50 and 75. And notice the prismatics sort of shows their life. Notice the high intensities start out lower to begin with, and so reach that minimum level in a shorter period of time. And then the super engineering grade, or even lower, and probably with just in a few years, it will reach the minimum values and have to be replaced. In terms of schedule, public agencies had until June of 2014 to implement and continue to use an assessment or management method designed to maintain regulatory and warning sign retroreflectivity above the minimum levels. So originally this included all signs, including guide signs, but notice now the requirement is to have an assessment or management method designed to maintain regulatory and warning sign retroreflectivity above the minimums. As far as guide signs, FHWA says, although guide signs are included in the minimum retro tables, there is not a specified compliance date for guide signs. Guide signs are to be addressed, or I should say, to be added to an agency's management or assessment method as resources allow. So again, documentation is important. And I think I mentioned earlier, originally there were compliance dates specified in the MUTCD. Those have been removed. There are no compliance dates, although the question I think related that someone asked earlier was about California, and I don't know about California because it's possible each state may, or certain states may have their own compliance dates. And I have to admit, I'm not familiar with California, but in terms of the national manual, the compliance dates were dropped. Agencies need to replace any sign they identify as not meeting the established minimum retro levels. That would be to lower your tort liability risk. Agency schedules for replacing signs are based on resources and relative priorities rather than specific compliance dates. So that's why FHWA removed the specific compliance dates. But bottom line is agencies still need to defend replacement decisions if liability issues arise. There are some resources out there. This is a little bit dated, but I think it's still some good resources. This is a National Cooperative Highway Research Program synthesis on practices to manage traffic sign retroreflectivity. The link is included there. It's available at no cost. It includes a lot of case studies of both state and local agencies and the methods they're using to comply with the MUTCD. So if you're looking for ideas of how other agencies have handled this, this would be a good resource. Also, the Federal Highway Administration, they have a sign retro web page, and the links are included here. So in sum, those of you involved with signing, your job really is the most important part of making this regulation successful. Intent of the regulation is to increase safety by increasing nighttime visibility. And I hope this has been helpful for you. The title slide had my email address. Feel free to reach out if I can answer questions. And I have one question for you all that's kind of a pop quiz at the end here. Of course, you see chevrons around this curve. And the chevrons, as we've talked about, they're a warning device. They need to comply with the minimum retro values. What about these sleeves on the sign supports? Do those have to meet the minimum retro values? In fact, this is similar maybe to the question someone asked about the retroreflective borders on the traffic signal back plates. But the chevrons need to be retroreflective and comply with the minimum criteria. The sleeves need to be retroreflective, but they don't need to meet the minimum requirements. They're considered an enhancement to enhance the conspicuity of the devices. So they're not considered a traffic control device themselves. And I forget who asked the question about the back plates this morning. During the break between these sessions, I did go online and try to find an answer, but I got mixed results. Artificial intelligence told me that those borders do need to meet the minimum requirements, but I couldn't, in my brief search, I couldn't find anything in FHWA materials that required that. So if anybody knows the definite answer to that, please type it in the chat. But my thought is that that retroreflective border around the back plate on a signal head is also sort of an enhancement to enhance the visibility of the signal head. So while, and my thought is it needs to be retroreflective, but in my thinking, it doesn't need to comply with the minimum criteria because it's not a traffic control device itself. It's I'll call it an enhancement to a traffic control device. So that's my best thought on that. We're running out of time. I want to thank everybody for participating. Thanks for your great questions. I appreciate it. And wish everybody a good rest of the day. Hope to see you at future LTAP training. Mike, I'll turn it back to you. I know you have some closing comments.
All right, thanks, Ron. We've reached the 2:30 time frame. If you don't mind, maybe we can do a few quick questions and then,
Sure.
yeah. So we did have a question from Aaron. He's asking, is it okay to use anti-graffiti film in signs? Does this affect the retroreflectivity results?
I would say it's okay to use it, but I would say yes, I believe it does affect the retroreflectivity. You might want to get, if you have access to or can borrow or rent a retro gun, just to kind of confirm what the effect would be. Because I think it's similar in concept to if you remember the comparison panels, I talked about how New York LTAP developed the idea of if you use these transparency film and place those over the sheeting, you can reduce the R value to near, say, the minimum R value. So I think the anti-graffiti stuff would also maybe have a similar effect. So I think I'd want to do some testing that, or maybe something to ask the manufacturer or the vendor of that product is if they could provide some data on what its effect is on the R value, on the retro value. Good question.
All right, thanks, Ron. There were a few questions about different types of retroreflectometer devices. I would just mention again that in the LTAP realm, we don't really endorse specific products. In the handout section, you'll see a copy of Ron's presentation today. You're welcome to download or save a copy of the presentation. He does talk about two of the devices that are commonly used. Beyond that, there is the comment that FHWA does not endorse specific products as well. So we would just share that. And Ron, anything else to add there?
No, I would just echo what you said. Yeah, LTAP can't endorse or promote particular products.
Okay. As far as the materials being available, yes, you can download today's presentation materials directly from the handout section. Within a day or two, we will also send out a follow-up email to today's participants. It will include the video recordings from this morning and this afternoon's webinars, and it also will include links to the presentation materials. So there's multiple avenues to access those items. And I guess any additional questions? At the start of the presentation, Ron mentioned he has his email address. So Ron, it's okay with you if people email questions to you?
Absolutely, yeah. Be glad to try to address them.
Excellent. Well, hey, thanks everyone so much for your participation today. We greatly appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks again.